Summer 2005. I'm scattering my grandmother's ashes on the mountain she used to play on, when a sudden freak gust of wind sends all that powder and grit in my face. It's in my eyes and my nose and my mouth. So I can't breathe, I can't see, I can't talk. It's as if she's trying to get my attention. For 30 years, I've been on a bit of a frantic journey trying to improve myself intellectually and spiritually, constantly reading, trying to kind of gain more knowledge so that I could prove myself, desperate to be intellectual enough to decipher answers to the big questions I was asking. But what I've come to know recently is that what I was lacking was wisdom. And you can't find wisdom in facts and in information. Wisdom is far more elusive and actually far more simple. And I found it in someone I'd overlooked and underestimated. My grandmother, Clare Barnsley. She left school in 1926 with no qualifications. She raised her family. And when they were grown, she cleaned people's houses so she had enough money for her dancing shoes and her Avon cream. She never read books. She didn't know anything, she didn't know much about world events. And she still believed that the television had to be turned off to let the valves cool down. She never went abroad, and apart from a few day trips, she stayed in her village, and we were very close. She was a massive inspiration to me. She used to give me butcher paper and betting shop pencils for me to draw, but instead of drawing, I would write poems about the ghosts she used to see. As I got older, when it came to matters of intellect and deep spiritual knowledge, I thought we were worlds apart. And though she taught me to waltz and made the best chips in the world, but don't tell my mum, I really did think, we're not connecting. Especially when she used to say to me, if you keep studying like that, you're going to get a bad head. So I stopped looking to her for answers. I had a naive belief that everything I needed was out there. I came from a mining village, and both my parents worked in factories. So they were always emphasizing to me the importance of education and getting a good job. So I followed that, and I went to university, and I became very overwhelmed very quickly and quite anxious with all the things I was supposed to know that I didn't know. I tried a lot of things to try and cure that anxiety. I did Tai Chi, actually not far from here. I read a lot of poetry, and I drank a lot of homebrew, and it didn't help. So I did what every sensible person who's looking for the truth does. I ran away to America. I studied a master's degree in the Deep South, and I thought to be immersed in rigorous research would bring me some knowledge. It would propel me into some deep insights. But in the intensity of all that Louisiana heat and the rigors of academic demands, I didn't become more knowledgeable and more clear. I became more confused and more overwhelmed. And being detached from home actually showed me very clearly how detached I was from myself. So, what have you done when you've been lost or in need of guidance? I reckon I've got a ton of those. I lost most of them in the Hurricane Katrina, but that's another TED talk. So I did lots of things. I sought out spiritual teachers. I went on shamanic retreats. I read mystical poets. As you said, I did a voodoo ceremony with a priestess in New Orleans. I read and reread books, listened to meditation CDs, Deepak Chopra, Eckhart Tolle, Pema Chodro, watched countless TED talks. But these things didn't bring me any insight and any peace and knowledge. These things actually brought me more despair. I was totally committed to this journey I wanted to experience, but I was very lost on the path. So I came back home to Wales, and it was nice to be back to the hills and my family and the sing-song voices on the buses that I'd missed. I started a PhD. I didn't finish it, but I started a PhD. And for a little while, I was really happy. But that itch came back, that deep desire for knowledge. And I'm not talking the knowledge I found in books. I'm talking that kind of, why am I here? Why am I always full of fear? Like right now, why am I full of fear? Why can't I articulate what's in my heart? Why don't I know what's in my heart? Fast forward to last month. I'm getting ready to go out. The taxi's coming. I'm looking good, except I need a necklace. I go to reach for it on the stand, but when I go to pull it, it's tangled with itself, and it's tangled with all the other necklaces. And the more I pull, the more it gets tangled. And in a temper that's been brewing for a very long time, I sling those chains across the floor, and that's it. Epiphany. All the lessons my grandmother ever gave me start to demand attention. You're going to love this. The chains that bind us. When I was little, my grandmother would sit me by the fire. She'd put a tray on my lap with a black cloth, and she'd hand me one of her necklaces, all tangled up. And she'd give me a pin. And by the fire, in the quiet, she would tell me to untangle it. I learned how not to pull the knot too tight. I learned how I could loosen it myself. I learned how sometimes after a long time of trying to undo the knot, you just got to go away and come back with fresh eyes. So, 13 years later, after her death, this starts to make a different kind of sense to me. So I thought she was always teaching me to be patient or to just make me be quiet by the fire. But actually, whether she knew it or not, there were deeper ramifications. She was showing me what it was. She was showing me how to acknowledge the knots in my thinking, that I had the tools to loosen them, and that I could be unafraid to do so. So then I started thinking back to other lessons she used to give me. Now, my nan was from Tredegar. I don't know if anybody else from Tredegar talks like this, but my nan did. She told me one day, when you wake up, just lie there for 5 minutes to allow for you to come back to your natural self. You've got to slip back into your body, because when you dream, you go off into another world. For 30 years, I've been going off into another world. I've been a professional seeker of answers. I've been going out there, far away from everything that was familiar and important to me. I hadn't been doing what my nan said. I hadn't been coming back to my natural self. So all the books in the world, all the shamanic retreats and voodoo stuff, none of that's going to help unless I'm connecting it to what's deep inside. I'd like to share a poem with you that I'd written about my gran to illustrate my lack of understanding. And it's called Taking It Out. When my grandmother chopped wood, when my grandmother chopped wood, split clean, the axe gleamed. When my grandmother chopped, not just for wood, but for the sound, for the chopping sound. When my grandmother chopped wood, I was safe. When my grandmother chopped, swung, heaved, halved. When my grandmother chopped wood, everyone went indoors. When my grandmother chopped wood, even the axe understood. Except, of course, I hadn't understood. I hadn't been making those connections. And I had ignored the fact that my grandmother was certain of the blade. She was certain of the wood, and she was certain that she would make a connection precisely where she aimed. I had doubted the axe. I told my nan I was super duper excited that I was having a publication, my first proper publication, and it was a story about her, and it was in Ms. Lexia magazine. She was very excited. Just before the publication came out, she died. It's not a completely sad story, though. The day she died, as she said goodbye to my auntie, she told her to tell me a poem she'd written, her first ever poem. I found a rose in my garden and took it indoors. A petal fell off, so I picked it up and held it to my nose. And as the day was done, I smelled that rose all day long. It was very beautiful. And I sent it to Ms. Lexia, and they published it in the next edition. So she and I both had our first publications in consecutive magazines. And I thought, oh, wow, what a gift. What a lovely poem. But I hadn't understood the depths of it. I thought it was simple, but in its simplicity lay its complexity. And It was the petal she held to her nose, not the rose, the part, not the whole. And in the part was the sum of everything the rose had been. And my grandmother was the petal coming away from its bud. And she must have known that on some level to be compelled to write this poem before she died. And I feel like the scent of her presence lingers in these lines. It gets a bit better. I was reading a novel a few years ago by Ruth Ozeki called A Tale for the Time Being. And Jiko, the great-grandmother, she's a Zen nun, on her deathbed asks to be lifted so she can write her death verse. Death verse? I never heard of death verse. It's a practice of Zen masters on their deathbed to write jisei, these death poems that are about impermanence and often blossoms falling. That made me pay a little bit of attention. I went back to my grandmother's poem. And the whole thing is almost like a koan, which is a Zen puzzle. It's like that's the necklace, that's the knot. And each line is a strand I have to pull out. So this has become my meditation, and every time I turn back to it, it means something different. So this has become quite an important poem to me. But it's a very personal thing. Why would you care? What's this to you? Well, you should listen to your nan. Even if she's dead, she'll talk like the necklace that was found earlier. She was saying, I hear your sister, or daughter, or granddaughter. Jack Cornfield says, wisdom is not necessarily flashy or powerful. It can manifest in a humble and simple heart and in the most ordinary seeming of lives. Now, TED and TEDx, they're supposed to be about the sharing of new ideas, but in a way, nothing's really new. I devoted years chasing this idea of I need new insights, a new knowledge, a radical shift in my perspective, when really I didn't. I didn't need that. I just needed to come back to my natural self. And I believe that we can all benefit from acknowledging the simple, seemingly simple people. That's you and me. And acknowledging those people and those activities that are seemingly everyday, but make a massive difference. And to meditate on and be guided by those things. We've seen examples of that here today. And I propose that we challenge where we think wisdom lies. So we don't spend a lot of money and energy running around the world in our tons of books and in shamanic retreats and on the yoga mat, although those things are good too. But that we have to bring them back to what's in here, what's already within us. And I think that is going to bring us more peace. And I'm better able now to accept the wisdom of my children because I'm more humble and I'm not looking out there. In his last sermon before his death, St David, Dewi Sant, said, Gwnewch y pethau bychain mewn bywyd. Do the simple things in life. This is what we should do, is just connect with one another and the seemingly simple and ordinary things we do. So maybe your dad taught you how to pull a radish from the ground and shake the dirt off. Or the barber in your village who's been cutting hair for almost 70 years. Maybe she's taught you more about human kindness than any sacred text. We have a barber here today who's proved that. Maybe we spend too much time in the garden with the rose. And all we need is a small and simple petal. Diolch yn fawr.